The custom ivory silk of her dress felt like a second skin, a whisper-thin promise of a future she had meticulously planned. Naomi stood outside the heavy oak door of the private dining room at the Gilded Lily, the low murmur of voices within a dissonant hum against the frantic symphony in her chest. She was supposed to be celebrating an engagement dinner, a final toast to her single life before it merged with Kazuo Tanaka's. His family, her future, all waiting on the other side of that door. But she had paused, her hand hovering over the cold brass handle, catching a sliver of conversation from within. It was her best friend, Brooke, her voice a saccharine poison. "Are you sure about this, Kaz? I mean, really sure? Her family has money, yes, but look at her, a beat of silence, thick with meaning." Then Kazuo's voice, the voice she had memorized, the one that whispered promises in the dark, now stripped of its warmth, laid bare and clinical. "It's a merger, Brooke, not a passion project. But every time we go to a company event, I see the way they look. The partners, their wives. She's a liability. A beautiful face, but the frame is too large for the picture I need to project." Naomi's breath hitched, a tiny, sharp sound lost in the restaurant's ambient noise. Her body, the vessel she had learned to love despite a world that told her not to, was being discussed like a balance sheet liability. Brooke laughed, a brittle, tinkling sound. "A big liability. I just worry about you. You deserve someone who compliments you. Someone sleek. A Porsche, not a town car." The cruelty was so casual, so effortless. "I know," Kazuo sighed, the sound a dagger of self-pity that twisted in Naomi's gut. "I'm handling it. Once the contracts are signed, I'll recalibrate. For now, we play our parts. Just be there for me." Naomi felt the blood drain from her face, a cold tide pulling all the warmth from her limbs. The ivory silk suddenly felt like a shroud. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was an assassination of her worth, executed by the two people she trusted most in the world. The oak door swung inward on silent, oiled hinges. The sudden flood of warm, golden light felt like an assault. All eyes turned to her. Kazuo's face, a mask of practiced charm, broke into a relieved smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There you are, my love." "We were about to send a search party." Brooke, seated beside him, looked up with wide, innocent eyes, a portrait of false concern. Naomi's gaze swept over the table, the pristine white linen, the gleaming silverware, the expectant faces of Kazuo's parents. The whole scene was a perfectly constructed lie, and she was meant to be its centerpiece. For a moment, her body remembered its old programming. Smile, smooth things over, make herself smaller to fit the space they had allotted her. But the woman who had stood in the hallway was gone, burned away by the acid of their words. In her place stood someone cold and clear and utterly finished with making herself palatable. She walked toward the table, her steps measured and deliberate. The room held its breath, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. She didn't look at Brooke. She didn't look at his parents. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, were locked on Kazuo. He started to rise, his hand outstretched. "Naomi." She ignored his hand. Reaching the table, she slowly, gracefully, pulled the antique diamond ring from her finger. It was his grandmother's, a heavy, ornate piece he had presented with a speech about legacy and honor. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the candlelight. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, her voice impossibly calm, a low, steady note in the suffocating silence. She didn't throw it. She didn't drop it. She placed it gently in the center of his bread plate, next to a pat of sculpted butter. It landed with a soft, final clink. Kazuo stared at the ring, then at her, his face a canvas of confusion and dawning horror. "What are you doing?" She finally allowed herself to look at Brooke, a brief, dismissive glance that took in her friend's perfectly tailored dress and perfectly feigned shock. Then her gaze returned to Kazuo. "I overheard. The Porsche, the town car, the recalibration." Each word was a perfectly polished stone, dropped into the quiet pool of their deception. A flush crept up Kazuo's neck, a blotchy, ugly red. "Naomi, that's not. You misunderstood." "No," she said, the single word cutting him off. "For the first time, I understand perfectly. She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of her life and the stunned silence of people who had just witnessed a queen abdicating a throne she had never truly wanted. The stares of the other diners in the main restaurant felt like physical blows, but she didn't flinch. Humiliation was a fire, and right now, she was letting it forge her into something new, something sharp and unbreakable. The bar was dark, smelling of old leather, spilled whiskey, and regret. Naomi sat in a corner booth, the ivory dress now a mockery of a celebration that had died before it began. She was nursing a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid a small, warm thing in the vast coldness of her shock. The initial rage had subsided, leaving behind a hollow, echoing numbness. She was a liability. The words played on a loop, a cruel mantra that threatened to erode the foundations of the self-worth she had fought so hard to build. She didn't notice the man until he was standing beside her booth, a tall, imposing silhouette against the bar's dim light. He moved with a liquid silence that was unnerving, a predator's grace. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his black hair impeccably styled. But it was his eyes that held her, dark, intelligent, and utterly devoid of pity. "Miss Williams," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low baritone, laced with an accent she couldn't immediately place, something sharp and precise. "You are having a difficult evening." She looked up at him, her first instinct to bristle at the intrusion. "Do I know you?" "No," he said simply. "But I know Kazuo Tanaka. My name is Minjun." He didn't offer a handshake. He simply slid into the opposite side of the booth, his presence consuming the available space, creating an immediate, intense intimacy. He signaled the bartender with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of casual, absolute authority. Kazuo Tanaka is a man who builds his world on perceptions, on image. Tonight, you shattered his most important image. Naomi stared at him, suspicion warring with a strange sense of validation. "You were there?" "I have people everywhere," he said, the statement delivered with the flat certainty of a law of physics. "They tell me things. They told me that the future Mrs. Tanaka just publicly returned her ring and dismantled her fiancé with 3 sentences. That requires a certain character." A fresh drink appeared before her. He had ordered for her without asking. Another woman might have been offended. Naomi just felt seen. He wasn't looking at her with sympathy. He was looking at her with something that felt like professional assessment. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice raspy. "I want to offer you a proposition," Minjun said, leaning forward slightly, his gaze intense. "Kazuo believes he has discarded you. I would like to help you show him that he was, in fact, the one who was discarded." His proposition was as audacious as it was terrifying. It was a cold, calculated piece of theater designed for an audience of one, and an entire criminal underworld. Minjun explained it in his calm, declarative way, laying out the pieces on the polished wood of the table as if discussing a chess match. Kazuo was on the verge of finalizing a crucial shipping alliance with the heads of the Korean syndicate, a deal that would solidify his power on the docks and make him untouchable. Minjun, as the head of a rival faction, could not allow this. A direct attack would trigger a bloody, protracted war. But social annihilation? That was an art form. Kazuo's greatest weakness is his obsession with status, Minjun explained, his long fingers steepled before him. He didn't leave you for love. He left you because he believed you were a detriment to his brand. He thinks your friend, the American girl, is an upgrade, an accessory that will help him close his deal. He paused, letting the clinical cruelty of his assessment sink in. "We will prove him wrong. We will show them all that you were not the liability. You were the asset." He was too foolish to recognize the plan was simple in its execution and baroque in its implications. There was a major dinner being held in 3 days at the Grand Imperial Hotel, a gathering of all the key players. Kazuo and Brooke would be there, cementing their image as the new power couple. "You and I will attend this dinner," Minjun stated. "Not as acquaintances. As husband and wife." Naomi almost choked on her bourbon. "You're insane. I am pragmatic," he corrected smoothly. "A rumor of an engagement can be dismissed. A marriage, announced publicly and with the backing of my organization, is a statement of fact. It tells the syndicate that you, the woman he deemed unworthy, have aligned yourself with his chief rival. It implies you brought something with you: information, loyalty, power. It will spook them. It will make Kazuo look weak, foolish, and untrustworthy. He saw the flicker of hesitation, the deep-seated fear in her eyes. This is not a request for your heart, Miss Williams. It is a business arrangement, a performance. Your payment will be his complete and utter ruin. And my payment, he added, a flicker of something cold and dangerous in his eyes, will be his ports. She thought of Kazuo's smug face, of Brooke's triumphant smirk. She thought of being called a town car, a liability. The hollow ache inside her began to fill with something else, something hard and cold. Crystallized rage. What are the terms? She asked, the businesswoman in her taking over. For the first time that evening, Minjun smiled. It was not a warm expression, but it was one of genuine, lethal approval. The next 48 hours were a blur of orchestrated activity, a masterclass in the deployment of wealth and power. Naomi was moved from her apartment into a penthouse suite at a hotel Minjun owned, a palace of glass and steel overlooking the city. Her old life was sealed off, a relic of a past she was rapidly leaving behind. The centerpiece of the operation was the dress. Minjun didn't send a stylist. He brought the artist herself. A legendary seamstress named Madame Cho, an elderly Korean woman with eyes that saw through fabric and into soul, arrived with 2 assistants and bolts of luminous, white silk. They worked in the suite's vast living room, transforming it into a bespoke atelier. Madame Cho circled Naomi, not with the critical eye of a department store clerk trying to hide flaws, but with the reverence of a sculptor studying marble. She took no measurements with tape, only with her eyes and the occasional, precise touch of her fingertips. Strong shoulders, she murmured in Korean, which one of Minjun's men translated. A queen's posture. We will not hide this. We will present it. Minjun was a quiet presence during the fittings. He would sit in an armchair across the room, conducting business in low tones on his phone, but Naomi felt his gaze constantly. He watched the dress take shape on her body, an edifice of silk and pearl seed beads. He was watching her transformation. The dress was not designed to make her look smaller. It was designed to make her look magnificent. It sculpted her waist, celebrated the curve of her hips, and fell in a heavy, regal train. It was a garment of pure power. During the final fitting, as Madame Cho adjusted the line of the collar, Minjun crossed the room. He stopped behind Naomi, his reflection meeting hers in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She saw herself, resplendent and formidable, and him, a dark, protective shadow at her back. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before his knuckles brushed the bare skin of her upper back, ostensibly to smooth a seam. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with a dangerous, unspoken chemistry. He saw a liability, Minjun said, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. He was looking at her reflection, at the powerful woman taking shape in the mirror. Men like him are blind. They see only the surface, never the foundation. I see an empire. His words were more intimate than any kiss Kazuo had ever given her. In the mirror, Naomi watched the last vestiges of the heartbroken woman in the ivory dress dissolve, replaced by the cool, sovereign gaze of the woman in white. The ballroom of the Grand Imperial Hotel was a sea of black tuxedos and jewel-toned gowns, a glittering ecosystem of predators and prey. The air was thick with the scent of hothouse flowers and expensive ambition. From a small, private balcony overlooking the main floor, Naomi watched the guests arrive. She could see Kazuo standing near the enormous central fountain, Brooke clinging to his arm like a designer handbag. They were holding court, laughing, accepting congratulations on whatever they were calling their union. They looked perfect, polished, happy, and utterly fraudulent. Naomi felt a ghost of her old self flicker within her, a tremor of anxiety, a pang of visceral hurt. Her hand instinctively went to the cold, heavy ring Minjun had placed on her finger an hour earlier. It was a solid, unadorned band of platinum. A prop, a promise, a shackle. Are you ready? Minjun's voice came from behind her. He stepped into the light of the balcony, a vision of lethal elegance in a black tuxedo. He carried 2 champagne flutes. He handed one to her, their fingers brushing. "They look like they own the world," she said, her voice tight. "They own a photograph," he corrected. "A temporary image. We are about to burn the negative." He looked down at the crowd, his face impassive, but she could see the cold fire in his eyes. He was a general surveying a battlefield before the first charge. "Remember the plan," he said. "We enter. We do not stop to speak to anyone. We go directly to the head table, which my men have already secured. We sit. We wait. He will come to us." He paused, turning to face her fully. "And when he does, you will not raise your voice. You will not weep. You will simply look at him as if you cannot quite remember his name." He lifted his glass. "To new partnerships, to new partnerships," she echoed, her voice firmer now. She took a sip of the champagne. It tasted of victory. He placed his hand on the small of her back, a gesture that was both possessive and profoundly steadying. His touch was a shield. "Let us make our entrance," he said. Together, they turned from the balcony and walked toward the grand staircase, descending into the heart of the enemy's territory, not as guests, but as conquerors. The show was about to begin. The moment they appeared at the top of the grand staircase, a hush fell over the ballroom. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and a wave of collective shock rippled through the crowd. The master of ceremonies, a man paid to announce arrivals, stuttered into his microphone. "Announcing Mr. Minjun," and he trailed off, confused. Minjun's grip on Naomi's back tightened slightly. "And my wife," he supplied, his voice carrying with effortless authority across the suddenly silent room. The announcement detonated like a bomb. Naomi kept her eyes forward, her chin high, focusing on the path their descent would carve through the stunned crowd. She was intensely aware of her appearance. The white gown was not merely a dress, it was a declaration. A bridal gown, worn not for the man who had discarded her, but for his replacement, his rival, his executioner. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel judged. She felt feared. She risked a glance at Kazuo. He was frozen by the fountain, his champagne glass halfway to his lips. His face was a mask of disbelief, slowly crumbling into rage, and beneath that a primal, unmistakable terror. Brooke looked as if she'd been slapped, her perfectly made-up face pale with shock. They looked small, insignificant. As Naomi and Minjun descended the final steps, the crowd parted for them as if they were royalty or a disease.
No one dared to speak to them.
They walked across the marble floor, the only sounds the soft click of her heels and the whispers that erupted in their wake. They reached the head table, a long, elevated dais reserved for the night's most important figures. Minjun's men, dressed as waiters and security, stood impassively at either end. He held her chair for her, a gesture of old-world chivalry that felt, in this context, like an act of supreme dominance. He sat beside her, and together they surveyed the room, a king and queen on their newly conquered throne. The message was brutally clear. The board had been reset. The woman Kazuo had deemed a liability was now seated in the most powerful chair in the room, beside the most dangerous man in the city. And the game had just begun. It didn't take long. Kazuo, his face a mottled mask of fury and humiliation, disentangled himself from Brooke and stormed toward their table. He moved with the jerky, uncoordinated rage of a man who had completely lost control of the narrative. 2 of Minjun's men moved to intercept him, but Minjun gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. They melted back into the shadows. "Let him come." Kazuo slammed his hands down on the pristine white tablecloth, making the silverware jump. "What the hell is this, Naomi?" he hissed, his voice a low, venomous spray. "What kind of sick game are you playing?" Naomi had prepared for this moment. She had rehearsed 100 cutting remarks, 1,000 accusations. But now, looking at his contorted face, she felt nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. He was pathetic. She followed Minjun's instructions, looking up at him with a placid, slightly bored expression. She let the silence stretch, forcing him to stand there, exposed and sputtering in front of the entire room. Finally, she turned to Minjun. "I do apologize," she said, her voice clear and carrying. It seems one of the junior associates is having some sort of episode. Is this going to be a problem? He's rather ruining the aesthetic. The insult was so complete, so dismissive, that Kazuo actually recoiled. He turned his rage on Minjun. You think you can just take what's mine? Minjun, who had been calmly sipping his water, placed his glass down with deliberate precision. He didn't rise. He didn't even lean forward. He simply met Kazuo's gaze with his flat, dead eyes. The word take implies she belonged to you, Minjun said, his voice soft, yet it sliced through the air. A man cannot lose what he was never worthy of holding. You did not own her. You were merely a placeholder, a footnote in her story. Now you are dismissed, he waved a hand, a gesture of utter finality. The two guards reappeared, materializing at Kazuo's elbows. They didn't touch him violently. Their presence was enough. A firm, irresistible pressure guided him away from the table, a disgraced prince being escorted from the throne room. Kazuo shot one last, desperate, hateful look at Naomi. She simply picked up her champagne flute and took a sip, her expression unbothered. She had not just won. She had rendered him irrelevant. The rest of the evening was a coronation. One by one, the patriarchs of the various families, including the senior members of the Korean syndicate Kazuo had been courting, made their way to the head table. They came not to challenge but to pay homage. They spoke to Minjun, but their eyes kept flicking to Naomi, assessing this new, unexpected power on the board. She played her part perfectly, nodding gracefully, offering small, non-committal smiles, exuding an aura of serene authority. She was a mystery they were now desperate to solve. By the end of the night, Kazuo's deal was dead. The syndicate members, spooked by the public, audacious alliance, had quietly withdrawn their offer. Kazuo and Brook had vanished, having slipped out a side exit in disgrace. Minjun had achieved his victory without firing a single shot, all through the strategic deployment of a woman his enemy had thrown away. Later, in the silent cocoon of the penthouse suite, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving Naomi feeling strangely weightless. The heavy silk gown was unzipped, pooling at her feet like a shed skin. She stood in her slip, looking out at the city's glittering expanse of lights. "It's done," she said quietly. Minjun came to stand beside her, his tie loosened, his jacket gone. He looked at her, his gaze tracing the lines of her shoulders, her back, the proud set of her head. The cold strategist was gone, replaced by someone more complex, more human. "You are magnificent," he said. It wasn't a compliment, it was a diagnosis. "You have a capacity for coldness I did not anticipate. It is a rare and valuable quality. He taught it to me," she said, a trace of bitterness in her voice. "He merely revealed what was already there," Minjun countered. "He mistook your warmth for weakness, your kindness for fragility." He did not understand that a fire can be used to forge steel. He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until it was charged with an unspoken current. He reached out, not to touch her skin, but to gently take her left hand, lifting it to the light. He looked at the simple platinum band on her finger. The prop. This was a contract, he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. A means to an end. The terms of that contract have been fulfilled, he paused, his dark eyes searching hers. "I would like to renegotiate." The final act of Kazuo's downfall came a week later. He wasn't summoned with threats or violence. He was invited for tea. He arrived at Minjun's headquarters, a minimalist high-rise that felt more like a modern art museum than a criminal enterprise, looking haggard and defeated. He had lost the syndicate deal, his reputation was in tatters, and Brooke, the sleek Portia he had traded everything for, had already left him, unwilling to be tethered to a falling star. He was shown into a serene office where Naomi sat alone, waiting for him. She was not dressed in a power suit or a dramatic gown. She wore simple, elegant loungewear, looking completely at home, utterly at peace. She was seated on a low sofa, a porcelain tea set on the table before her. When Kazuo entered, she didn't stand. She simply gestured to the chair opposite her. "Kazuo," she said, her voice gentle. "Please sit." He remained standing, defiant and broken. "What do you want? To gloat? To have your new husband finish me off?" "He isn't here," she said calmly, pouring tea into a small cup. This conversation is between you and me. She looked up at him, her gaze clear and direct. There was no anger left in her, only a kind of sad finality. I wanted to understand why he finally crumpled into the chair, the fight draining out of him. I was a coward, he whispered, the confession raw. I was afraid. Afraid that you were too much. Too bright, too strong. I thought if I had someone smaller, simpler, I would look bigger by comparison. It was all about how I looked. It was a pathetic, selfish reason, but it was the truth. Naomi listened, and in his confession, she found the last key to her own freedom. His cruelty hadn't been about her at all. It was about his own gaping inadequacy. Minjun entered the room then, silent as smoke, and stood behind her sofa, his hand resting on her shoulder. A silent statement of ownership and protection. Kazuo flinched. Minjun looked down at Naomi. "What is your decision?" he asked. It was a test. A final transfer of power. Kazuo's fate was in her hands. She could have him destroyed, erased. She looked at the pathetic man in the chair, a hollowed-out shell of the villain who had haunted her, and she felt nothing. He was already gone. "My decision," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of a true queen, "is that he is no longer my concern." She turned her gaze to Kazuo one last time.
Go.
Build a new life. And never let me see your face again. It was not forgiveness. It was erasure, the ultimate power move. As he stumbled from the room, a ghost vanished from her world. Minjun's hand tightened on her shoulder. She leaned back into his touch, the fake marriage, the strategic alliance, blossoming into something real and dangerously beautiful. She was no one's liability. She was the head of a new empire, sitting on a throne she had built herself, with her king by her side.